The Institute.
Institute for Justice.
The National Law Firm for Liberty.
My name is Melanie Hildreth, and I'm here today with IJ Director of Strategic Research Dick Carpenter and IJ Senior Attorney Dan Albin. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into the forfeiture report that IJ released just this week called Fighting Crime or Raising Revenue, Testing Opposing Views of Forfeiture. So, Dick, can you get us started by talking about what we studied in this report and why we decided to do this research in the first place?
Yes, the title says it all, Fighting Crime or Raising Revenue. We were testing two competing theories of forfeiture. One that's advanced by forfeiture proponents, that is, forfeiture is an effective crime-fighting tool. In essence, they'll say it's an essential crime-fighting tool because they think that removing the lifeblood of criminal activity is a way to fight crime. So seizing and forfeiting cash and other properties actually is a crime-fighting tool. So that's the proponent's argument. What opponents of forfeiture, and we're among them, say, is that forfeiture is a way to raise revenue. And we call it a profit incentive or a perverse profit incentive. And it has the potential to distort law enforcement toward raising revenue and away from traditional crime-fighting activities. So this report is really testing these two competing theories. We were interested in it because over the decade or more that we have been researching forfeiture, and certainly longer as IJ has been involved in it, it's boiled down to these two arguments by law enforcement and by opponents, including IJ. So we wanted to put those two to the test and really go after that as directly as possible.
And those are the same arguments that we encounter in our legislative efforts when we're trying to bring about reform, both at the state and federal level. Law enforcement will say, no, forfeiture is a critical tool for us to be able to fight the war on drugs, to go after the drug kingpins. And if you take this away from us, there's going to be this huge uptick in crime because we're not going to be able to do our jobs. Meanwhile, proponents of reform say, no, this is really about just getting extra money for police, often spending it on things that the legislature would never agree to because these are off-budget funds that have very little oversight. And it, in fact, diverts the police's attention from solving crimes that I think your average citizen would want them to focus on.
And the legislators are torn then between those two views with no real way to analyze them?
Yeah, and legislators are very concerned about the civil rights and civil liberties issues that are raised by civil forfeiture. They're concerned about the damage it does to property rights. But then they hear from law enforcement saying how important it is for fighting crime, and of course, no legislator wants to be labeled as weak on crime. So, oftentimes when there's this kind of tug of war without a clear resolution, they ultimately will defer to law enforcement, thinking, well, these are our public servants. We'll trust in them, and defer to their judgment.
So we will dive deep into the report, but first, Dick, can you just give us the bottom line? What did we find on those issues? What was the report's?
The bottom line is forfeiture does not improve crime fighting, and it appears to raise revenue. So during periods of economic downturn, law enforcement will turn to forfeiture to raise money.
Dan, was that a surprise to you?
No,
as a litigator?
This is pretty much what we expected from the standpoint of IJ's forfeiture team that litigates these cases and that advocates for legislative reform. We already knew that what drives forfeiture is this profit incentive that police are trying to seize and forfeit as much money as they can because it goes to a fund that only they can use and only they can spend. So it wasn't a surprise to us that this sort of profit incentive is what motivates forfeiture. I think the part that may surprise some folks is that forfeiture doesn't have any benefit as a crime-fighting tool, as this study finds.
We may not be surprised, but the report author was surprised. In fact, when he was quoted in the Washington Post, that's exactly what he said. Dr. Brian Kelly is the author. He's at Seattle University. So when Brian and I first talked about this study, I mentioned that we're interested in testing these two competing theories, and he had already done some work on looking at the relationship between forfeiture and crime. So that was building on work that he had already done, but he had never considered the question of whether there's a relationship between forfeiture and revenue. So when we said, we're really interested in this, he said, okay, I'll do it. But he was very skeptical that there would be a relationship. So he was surprised, even though we were not.
Oh, interesting. Well, and his previous research, was he the one that looked into the median amounts generated in
His research was very
forfeitures
similar to what's in this report.
Okay.
So he was interested in examining the relationship between changes in forfeiture and changes in metrics of crime, basically. So this very much builds on his prior work. It's much bigger. It uses some additional measures of crime that he didn't use before. It has more data. So it's a much more robust study than he did before, but it's very similar in concept.
So the aspect of forfeiture that this study focuses on is something called equitable sharing. Dan, for members of the audience and those listening who don't know what equitable sharing is, can you describe it? Can you give a definition?
Sure. So the Federal Equitable Sharing Program is a program operated by DOJ that partners with local and state law enforcement agencies, and it allows them to, after they've seized property or when they've seized property in conjunction with a joint federal-state task force, to turn that seized property over to the feds, and then DOJ pursues the forfeiture. And if it's successful, equitably shares, as they describe it, the profits of this forfeiture with the agency that did the initial seizure. Usually that's an 80-20 split. So the local or state law enforcement agency will get back 80% of what they seized, and the feds will keep 20% as essentially a processing fee. And so this equitable sharing program allows police and law enforcement in states that have more protective laws that protect people's property rights and limit civil forfeiture. It allows law enforcement in those states to circumvent those protections by simply handing their seizures over to the feds and allowing the forfeiture to be done under the much more permissive federal forfeiture law.
And so, Dick, why is this what we chose to study in this? Why look at equitable sharing in this report as opposed to those state forfeitures or some others?
Some of it was practical. Those data just exist. Many states don't require agencies to report their forfeiture activity. So we have no idea how much forfeiture activity occurs in many of these states. So it stands to reason if they're not reporting it, we don't have data and we can't study it. But the Department of Justice has for many years now been reporting how much forfeiture they take in and how much of that is equitable sharing, how much goes back to the states. So there were just data available. So it's a practical reason. But there was also a substantive reason. The substantive reason is this program is enormous. This occurs in every state in the country, plus it occurs outside of the U.S. borders. There are countries that participate in equitable sharing with the United States. There are commonwealths of the United States that participate in equitable sharing. So this program is gigantic. Since 2000, we have seen more than $8 billion go from the Department of Justice and the Treasury Department back to local and state law enforcement agencies. So this thing is enormous. And you will often hear attorneys general, Jeff Sessions, when he was Attorney General, they will often say, well, this is really an effective crime-fighting tool. This program is essential to crime fighting. So there's a sincere belief that equitable sharing is an important crime-fighting tool. So not only was there a practical reason, but there was a real substantive reason to study it as well.
So you touched on the conclusions when we at the start of the conversation. Let's get into how you actually studied, how you and Brian Kelly and put together the report. The first conclusion was more forfeiture revenue does not mean more crime solved. Can you talk about how do you begin to analyze that?
Yes. So the basic relationship is the one between forfeiture and crime fighting. So forfeiture we already talked about. That's equitable sharing. On the crime fighting side, Brian used several different measures. One was what we call clearances or arrests. So clearing crime by arresting. So he gathered data on arrests related to all kinds of major crimes, and that became one of the outcomes. The second outcome, which had not been used before, and this is one that we contributed to, and that was drug use. When equitable sharing and forfeiture in general were both expanded in the 1980s, it was largely driven by the war on drugs. And even now, when we see forfeiture in action, it's largely motivated by fighting drug trafficking and trying to break up drug cartels. So it's very much about how do we reduce drug use in the United States. So it stands to reason then that measuring drug use is a natural outcome. So not only crime, but also drug use. So we took advantage of a survey that's done on a regular basis by the federal government that measures drug use. So we looked at the relationship between forfeiture and levels of drug use over time. And we gathered more than a decade worth of data. Some of the data were annual, some of them were triennial, and looked at that relationship between those two things. That is forfeiture and drug use and forfeiture and crime.
And he found that there's no relationship between increased forfeiture and decreased drug use, and then just a little tiny bit with respect to crime, right? It was like maybe for every $1,000 per officer, it was 2 more crimes solved in a year.
I think the important thing is that none of the relationships were statistically significant in the conventional way that we measure it. Sometimes you'll hear it called no meaningful relationship. But even if there were a significant relationship, getting to what you're asking about, the effect was minuscule, teeny tiny. And this is, in fact, what he found in his first study that was published in an academic journal, that there was a significant relationship, but the practical effect was so small that the expense that goes into this, and certainly the threats to property rights, in no way benefited from this teeny tiny positive effect.
So then the thing that was the surprise to him that we didn't expect was that he didn't expect, that revenue component. How is that something that you measure? How do you measure fiscal stress and compare that to forfeiture?
Right. So in this study, we examined it in 2 different ways. First is he looked at unemployment rate, which is a very common proxy for fiscal stress. It stands to reason that during the economic downturns, people are out of work and they don't have the ability to necessarily contribute to city and county budgets, so city and county budgets are stressed. And then in addition to that, what you'll see is that people who are out of work or unemployed, they will also need more in terms of social services. So they're basically demanding more from the government while at the same time not contributing to it, which then exacerbates the stress on city and county governments. So it's a very common measure of fiscal stress. Another one that he looked at was just personal income. So we would expect that personal income is going to go up and down as a result of economic downturns and so forth. So those were the 2 measures that he used to measure fiscal stress. And in this case, what he was essentially doing was flipping the relationship. So in the first one, he's saying, does forfeiture contribute to changes in drug use or crime? But in this one, he's saying, does economic stress contribute to changes in forfeiture? You see the difference in the direction? So that's how he measured those 2 things.
And I loved in the study, there were some anecdotes. Well, I mean, they're shocking from Tennessee, that really anecdotes that show the real world implications of the ability to profit from this. And Dan, can you just talk about, these are, I think, things that you've seen before too, the Tennessee anecdote and then the one about South Carolina.
Sure. So one example is the Rolling Thunder annual event, I suppose you could call it, in South Carolina, where law enforcement there spends a week doing very intensive highway interdiction on certain stretches of the highway in certain counties with a huge focus, almost to the exclusion of anything else, of pulling people over and trying to get an excuse to search the car and then seizing anything they can. It's a practice that is pretty outrageous from a civil liberties perspective. It certainly diverts law enforcement resources away from anything else that might be going on that week, and it's not it's not an isolated incident. We see this sort of thing happening all over. There are actually several Rolling Thunder type events that are held in South Carolina each year. And it's not limited to South Carolina either. There are a number of law enforcement agencies that do these sorts of things, and it's a regular, ongoing practice. The incident outside of Nashville that was covered by News Channel 5 down there in a real excellent example of investigative reporting and sort of an expose of the task force practices down there on Interstate 40 in Nashville. That just background for our listeners and viewers. The general understanding of drug trafficking in the United States, if you're trying to combat it, is that money flows south and to the west, and drugs flow north and to the east. And so if you're policing an interstate, the westbound direction is going to have cash, and the eastbound direction is going to have drugs, because the drugs are coming either from the West Coast or from our southern border, and the money is going back in that same direction. And so this task force outside of Nashville spent 90% of their time policing the westbound lanes, where the cash would be expected to be flowing, and only 10% of their time doing highway interdiction on the eastbound lanes, where you'd expect they'd be able to pick up drugs. That shows how the profit incentive distorts law enforcement priorities. If your real goal was to keep drugs off the streets, you would probably flip that and spend 90% of your time on the eastbound lanes trying to stop drugs from getting to the East Coast. But if you seize drugs, you have to destroy them. You don't get to spend that money on goodies for your department. And so what law enforcement does is it responds to these incentives and instead sets up on the westbound lanes so they can get the money that's coming back from the drug sales on the East Coast and use that money for all kinds of off-budget stuff. And at the same time they're doing this, they're pulling over lots of people that have absolutely nothing to do with drug dealing, and they get caught up in these circumstances and end up being innocent victims of this profit incentive.
It's worth mentioning that people in law enforcement recognize that relationship as well. They don't say it very often, but some will acknowledge it. So Roger Peterson, for instance, who was the former chief of police in Rochester, Minnesota, several years ago, he was testifying in the state legislature on behalf of or in support of reform of forfeiture laws in Minnesota. And he described a choice that police officers often face. The choice, they see a drug deal. Now they face a choice. Do they go after the buyer and remove from the street illegal drugs, or do they go after the seller and get cash for the agency to use? His concern was that they would be compelled to go after the cash and not the drugs and remove those from the streets. And another great example is from Philadelphia. So in Philadelphia, we had a giant case that's come to a great conclusion. In that particular case, the police watched a drug deal go down involving the son of our clients, the Sorvellises. They could have arrested the buyer on the street and got the drugs, but they didn't. They could have arrested the Sorvellis' son on the street and grabbed $40 because he sold drugs on the street, down the street from their house. But they didn't do that. They waited to arrest him at home so they could seize his entire house. That's what we mean by perverse profit incentive.
And there's a great point I think it's in this study, that some of these task forces are actually self-funding, that they if they don't forfeit enough money, they might lose their jobs.
Often, yes, that's often the case with the drug task forces in particular. The drug task forces are a cooperative effort of multiple law enforcement agencies, county sheriffs, police departments, who will dedicate an officer, maybe a couple of officers, to this task force. And this task force is not paid for by the budgets of the county and police departments. It's paid for, it's self-funded by whatever they're able to grab. And so it stands to reason then that if the entire existence of the task force is dependent upon raising its own revenue, that's exactly what they're going to do.
Yeah, you have these outrageous stories, great attention, as you said, the investigative journalism. The Washington Post did how many policy reports come out in D.C. every year, and how many get an exclusive in the Washington Post, which is what this study got. So congratulations on that. With that attention, now we have the stories, we have the data that says, these aren't actually just anecdotes. They're outrageous stories, but they are representative of this broader trend. What can be done with that information, Dan, as you look at advocacy on this issue? What can you do with this report?
Sure. So certainly at the legislative level, I think this answers a lot of the questions that legislators have. And so when we go back to state legislators next session, we have this evidence of what the actual effects of forfeiture are. and that the idea that it is really an important crime fighting tool is debunked. And it shows that, in fact, it is used to raise revenue. And that suggests a solution that we've long been promoting, which is delinking forfeiture from this profit incentive and eliminating the profit incentive by making sure that any funds that are forfeited go to a general fund or a state school fund, something not controlled by law enforcement and that doesn't directly benefit law enforcement. That eliminates the profit incentive. It eliminates this situation where you have these self-funding task forces that exist solely to essentially scoop up cash from motorists, and creates a situation where the legislature or the city council gets to decide how to spend any money that is seized through forfeiture. And so what I think state legislatures should be considering is eliminating that profit incentive, sending all of the forfeiture funds to the general fund, or in states that already do that, like, for example, Missouri, eliminating the equitable sharing loophole. Don't allow state and local law enforcement officers in your state to participate in this equitable sharing program. Make them follow state law so that they're not driven by these perverse profit incentives, and instead are focused on actually enforcing the law and preventing crime.
And I would add to that, in those places, in those states where they require that the forfeiture money go to a neutral fund, a general fund, that they actually watch it and track it and make sure that, in fact, happens, because we are aware of the fact that this is supposed to happen, and there are ways to get around it, and so it doesn't always happen as it's supposed to.
Absolutely, and we've even filed lawsuits over that, for instance, in Indiana, challenging the use of forfeiture funds there, supposed to go to school funds, but instead are being spent by law enforcement. Happens in some other locations as well, and it's the sort of thing that it opens states up for lawsuits so long as someone is following what they're doing and seeing that, hey, you guys aren't following the law here.
Which also requires having transparency. So this is another thing, Dan, you might want to talk about. What are our efforts in making sure that we can actually track that?
Absolutely. So the first step, I think, in any forfeiture reform effort is creating transparency, understanding what law enforcement is doing with respect to forfeiture, how much they're seizing, who they're seizing it from, whether those people are ever charged with a crime. If so, what crime? Are they ever convicted of that crime? Where are these seizures taking place? Are they taking place on the highways, at airports? Are they parts of raids on homes? Are there warrants involved? Or are these warrantless searches? All of those sorts of pieces of information are things that would be good to know when looking at what is actually happening in a given state. And so in many states where there isn't transparency, legislators kind of throw up their hands and say, well, we can't tell if there's any problems here. Law enforcement says there's no problems. What evidence do you have that this is a widespread practice? And we don't have the evidence because there's no transparency. They're not providing the information. And so bills requiring law enforcement to produce reports on what they're doing with respect to forfeiture on an annual basis, at the agency level. So we know which agencies are engaging in the most forfeiture and, what crimes they are alleging are associated with those forfeitures, from whom are they conducting those forfeitures, that sort of thing, helps paint a much clearer picture of what's going on. And then legislators, once they see those facts, can make up their own minds rather than just rely on law enforcement to tell them that everything's okay.
Are there states that do this particularly well that you or others at IJ hold up as a model? Like, this is how you should be tracking this information?
Yeah, well, there are several states that have good reporting requirements. Dick, what would you say are some of the leading states for that?
Well, as a result of work that we have done, Florida has now become a leading state in that it is requiring all the agencies to report this information. It's supposed to be kept in a database that's accessible, that can be used to do centralized reporting. So Florida is amongst the leading states now, again, because of our work in prompting them to adopt legislation related to transparency. So I think Florida's a good one. Minnesota has been doing it well for many years. It's not perfect. It could be better. But compared to what many states have, which is nothing, Minnesota has looked pretty good. And we've been using their data. So those are two, I think, very good states. And there's some others that have recently adopted transparency requirements, and so we should expect to see those fruits pay off, or those efforts pay off in fruit. But some states, even though they have transparency requirements or have adopted them recently, we're discovering law enforcement isn't necessarily complying as they're supposed to. And Mississippi is one that has recently come to our attention, where agencies haven't been reporting as they're supposed to. So that means IJ will once again get involved to hold their feet to the fire in the transparency and reporting.
Making sure that law has some force.
Yeah, and we've done that before. In Georgia, they were required to issue reports on forfeiture, and the agencies just ignored that requirement. And so we brought a lawsuit demanding that they comply with that part of the law and prevailed. So this isn't, IJ's first time at the rodeo. We're here to, as a law firm, actually enforce the law. And so once we pass some of these reforms, constant vigilance is required to make sure that law enforcement is actually complying, putting together the reports that has the information they're required to produce. And if they don't do that, enforcing it in the courts.
And sometimes when we're pushing for transparency, law enforcement will say, oh, this is so burdensome, we could never do this, and we would take up all of our time. But in fact, as we've already said, there are states already doing this. So it's not as though it can't be done. In life, things boil down to can't and won't, right? And so this is not a can't, this is a won't.
Absolutely.
And I mean, it's also part of being responsible with the funds. I mean, if you have access to hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars in forfeiture funds, it's probably a pretty good idea to document it to make sure some of it doesn't just walk out the door or get spent on some of the ridiculous things that it gets spent on. And if you have to produce reports saying what you're spending the money on, you're probably going to do less spending of the money on things like margarita machines and trips to Aspen, and hopefully be a little bit more accountable with how the money is spent. That said, the best way to control the expenditure of forfeiture funds is to send them back to the legislature and let the legislature control them through the general fund or a school fund, so that elected officials are exercising oversight over these funds and not letting them be an off-budget slush fund controlled by law enforcement.
Well, and so as we discussed, the report does a great job of putting the bigger themes together that we see in a lot of IJ's cases. But, as we are a law firm, as you mentioned, Dan. So what on the litigation front are we doing to address some of the issues that this report really highlights, the profit motive and other things? Sure.
So IJ has long recognized the centrality of this profit incentive to the problem of forfeiture, and especially civil forfeiture. And so in a number of our cases, we are directly challenging this profit incentive as a violation of due process. And that's because anytime someone is accused of a crime or is at least going to be deprived of property because it is supposedly connected to a crime, they have a right to due process of law. And due process requires a neutral arbiter as well as neutral enforcement of the laws. And when there is a profit incentive that motivates both police and prosecutors and affects both whose property is seized, what it is seized for, and whether forfeiture is pursued in a given case, that affects the neutrality. It, in fact, prevents the neutrality of the folks enforcing these laws and deprives people of their due process rights. And so we've brought challenges to these practices in places across the country. In our Philadelphia class action lawsuit that was mentioned earlier, where we achieved a fantastic settlement that completely redoes Philadelphia's forfeiture system, we challenged the profit incentive because police and prosecutors were getting a huge portion of their budget from forfeiture funds, and this was driving the behavior of law enforcement officers on the street who were shaking people down and seizing amounts as low as $40 or $50, and it was affecting the actions of prosecutors who were sort of uncritically accepting whatever was brought to them by the police and pursuing seizures of entire homes like the Sorvellises based on the fact that their son lived in the house, even though the owners of the home had no idea about this, weren't involved in any kind of illegal activity, and just happened to be caught up in it because their son got involved with some bad folks and exercised some poor judgment. So it really was affecting police and prosecutor behavior in Philadelphia, and that was a centerpiece of our lawsuit. As it turned out, the city largely agreed with the fact that was a problem and stopped doing some of those things not long after we brought the lawsuit, and agreed to stop doing them permanently as part of the settlement. Recently in Albuquerque, we challenged Albuquerque's continued use of forfeiture, despite New Mexico basically eliminating civil forfeiture. Albuquerque thought they could continue doing vehicle seizures and impoundments outside of that state law, and they were local prosecutors there were profiting from these vehicle seizures and sales. And we were able to persuade a judge that this violated due process and secured a ruling that Albuquerque's program violated the due process rights of the people who were having their cars seized by police and prosecutors that had a profit incentive through their agency to continue doing this. So we continue to bring these sorts of lawsuits. We'd love to obviously secure a victory at the circuit level, but that's something off in the future, and we continue to challenge this profit incentive in our cases.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you, Dick. That concludes our show today. Thanks, too, to IJ's supporters who make all of this work possible. If you'd like to keep updated with our activities in this way, please don't forget to subscribe.